Good morning. I'm Bob Hauser, Executive Officer of the American Philosophical Society. I want to welcome all of you to the second day of our conference, Making Nature, the Labor of Natural History, which is a collaboration between the Society and the Academy of Natural Sciences of Drexel University. I'm delighted that you've joined us this morning, especially so many of you, whether in Benjamin Franklin Hall or through our live stream. The first day of the conference, held at the Academy of Natural Sciences, was terrific, in my humble opinion, and I expect that today's presentations and discussions will be equally stimulating and informative. The American Philosophical Society acknowledges with respect that it resides in Lenapehoking, the homeland of the Lenape people, whose historical relationships with this land continue to this day. We recognize their continued presence and perseverance despite centuries of land theft, removal, and persecution of their language and cultural traditions. Throughout its history, the Society has benefited from its residents in this part of Lenape land, now called Philadelphia. We honor the Lenape community and also those of other Native peoples through our collections, fellowships, research awards, and engagement activities. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743 with the mission of promoting useful knowledge. Most of our nation's founders were members, and the APS had Thomas Jefferson as its president for 17 years, during most of which time he was either vice president or president of the United States. Like the Constitution, the presidency, on some occasions the Congress and the courts, as a source and keeper of knowledge, the Society was an essential piece of the bedrock on which our new nation was founded almost 250 years ago. It remains so today. While we at the Society continue to admire Franklin and Jefferson and their peers for their key roles in the formation of our nation, for their leadership of the Society, and for their devotion to science, education, and other noble causes, we also are much aware of their faults, most significantly their slaveholding. We at the APS are committed to sustaining the better parts of their legacies while we work towards a future of inclusion, diversity, equity, and access, the APS idea. The Society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who've made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts, the humanities, and public life. The Society promotes research by providing close to $2 million a year in research and grants and fellowships, primarily to younger scholars and to those in marginal appointments who need support the most. Our library and museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. The Society also sustains an informed citizenry. We do that through our meetings, publications, conferences, and exhibitions, influencing the influences, we hope, and other outreach activities. It's now my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Michelle Craig McDonald, Director of the Society's Library and Museum, who will introduce today's program. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. As Bob mentioned, my name is Michelle McDonald. I'm the director of the library and the museum here at the American Philosophical Society, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to day 2 of Making Nature the Labor of Natural History. Today's conference was in many ways inspired by the Society's current exhibition, Sketching Splendor, Natural History in America from 1750 to 1850, which is currently on view in Philosophical Hall. And I do want to encourage those of you who are here in person to view the exhibition when you have time, during a break, during lunch, or it is also in the same building where we are having the end of conference reception tonight. So please do take a look. It is a wonderful show, and we have our brand new, hot off the presses, probably still warm exhibition catalog, which arrived earlier this week. I know, it's lovely. It's true. I want to give you a few housekeeping ideas before we begin. Today's conference will be composed of 4 sessions, each of which is roughly 90 minutes, though we have had one speaker drop from session 2, and since we have 4 wonderful speakers in session 1, we decided to let that session run a bit longer. So session 1 is going to be running today until 10:45, and the break will be from 10:45 to 11:15, with the second session beginning then at 11:15. Each speaker is supposed to be presenting for about 15 minutes, which should leave plenty of time for questions, answers, and discussion. This is also a hybrid event, so in addition to those of you who are joining us in person, I extend my greetings to those of you who are watching us online. You are also encouraged to participate in the conversation using the chat function, as well as social media. You can see us on hashtag MakingNature2024. And for those of you who are online, you'll be happy to know that the exhibition is on view until the end of the calendar year. So while you may not be able to see Sketching Splendor today, I do encourage you to come back. We will have light refreshments after each session to keep you well fortified as we go through today's activities. Lunch, of course, is on your own, but we do have a list of restaurants to make that easier for you. With all of those things in mind, I would now like to officially launch the conference today by turning things over to Anna Marley, who will be moderating this morning's panel on Philadelphia Connections. Anna is the Chief of Curatorial Affairs at the Kenneth R. Woodcock Curator of the Historical American Art at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. She is a scholar herself of American art and material culture from the colonial era to 1945, and she has curated 16 exhibitions. She is in the perfect position to help guide this morning's conversation. And so now I turn it over to you, Anna.
Thank you so much, everyone. Good morning. I'm happy to see you all this morning, and thank you, Adriana, for inviting me to be a part of this. I'm always thrilled to come back to the APS and take a break from my administrative responsibilities as Chief of Curatorial Affairs to actually go back to the 18th century and think about some scholarship that I love. So I'm thrilled to be introducing the speakers today. I think their papers are going to be fascinating and really well connected. And I also wanted to let you know that I just checked with my team at PAFA. We have a show up right now called Artists as Cultivators, which is about art and gardening, care, and community from the 18th century to today. And the first work in the show is Charles Willson Peale's painting of his garden at Belfield. So I checked with our team at PAFA, and if you show your conference badge, you can get 50% off admission. So I would encourage you to go see the exhibition today, tomorrow, or Sunday. And I'm sorry to say that Mr. Charles Willson Peale himself is actually in Albuquerque right now. He is traveling in a nationally touring exhibition called Making American Artists. So you won't be able to see the artist in his museum. You'd have to go to Albuquerque for that. But please come back. And we will be renovating our beautiful historic landmark building starting in August. So this may be a last opportunity for people to see the building before we close it for a year for HVAC renovation. So I encourage you to go see the show if you have time and you're looking for something to do. So really, I'm so excited to see the exhibition here. I'm so excited for these papers. So what I'll do is I'm going to introduce each speaker briefly. You have their full bios, and then I will let them each come up. Then I will return with them, and we moderate a conversation between the papers. So our first presenter today is Kacey Stewart. Kacey is a postdoctoral associate at the University of Buffalo's Department of Environment and Sustainability. And he is an multidisciplinary scholar studying environmental narratives with a particular focus on how scientists use data to tell stories. And Kacey, I'm going to introduce the other speakers too. Yeah, no, you can wait right there, wait in the wings, just so I don't have to keep coming up and I can take notes on all the great conversations. Our second speaker is Matthew Halley, an ornithologist and historian who has conducted extensive research on birds in the Americas, Asia, and the Middle East. And Matthew, I wore this for you. There you are. Okay. Birds. I was inspired by your paper. And he is the assistant curator of birds at the Delaware Museum of Nature and Science and a research associate at the Academy of Natural Sciences. Victor Monnin completed his doctoral degree in epistemology and history of science at the University of Strasbourg and is currently a substitute assistant professor of history at John Jay College. Victor researches and writes about the history of paleo art and the depiction of geological past in popular culture. And Tyler Spencer is a PhD candidate at NYU's Institute of Fine Arts, specializing in American art and the history of photography. And his dissertation research grapples with issues related to production, use, and circulation of images for geological surveys in the 19th century. So I cannot wait to hear all of these papers and have a robust conversation. So thank you, Kacey.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for having me. Thrilled to be a part of this panel on Philadelphia connections as someone with my own Philadelphia connections. It's good to be home. To all my family and friends out there, yo. So the life and work of John Bartram needs little repeating at a conference such as this one, but for the uninitiated, a quick summary. Bartram, a Quaker, lived here in Philadelphia on the banks of the Schuylkill River. He created the first botanical garden in North America and explored widely, garnering a reputation as the best, if untutored, botanical mind in British North America, eventually resulting in his appointment as royal botanist. He also, lore tells us, suggested the APS to Franklin, so there's that connection. So today, I'd like to focus on one specific journey made by Bartram, and that is the one to Onondaga. While he kept journals for many of his botanical expeditions, the trip to Onondaga is his longest published work. The full title, Observations on the Inhabitants, Climate, Soil, Rivers, Productions, Animals, and Other Matters Worthy of Notice made by Mr. John Bartram in his travels from Pennsylvania to Onondaga, as he said, Oswego, and the Lake Ontario in Canada, is an incredibly apt title as the book is full of such observations. The journey was a diplomatic mission for Conrad Weiser, a German living on the Pennsylvania frontier who was an accomplished interpreter with indigenous peoples. The party also included Lewis Evans, a surveyor and mapmaker who used data recorded on the journey to produce this map of Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey, depicting the journey with a dotted line and his own notes of the trip written in the empty spaces. Kind of a fascinating map. So as the map shows, Bartram and Evans traveled up the Schuylkill to Weiser's home, and the three set off going up and down the ridges of central Pennsylvania, up the Susquehanna River, and on to Onondaga, present-day Syracuse. While Weiser negotiated with the Six Nations, Bartram continued on to visit Fort Oswego on Lake Ontario. Although he hoped the trip would form a loop, continuing east along the Mohawk Trail, the guides refused, and the party returned the same way they came. After years of publishing difficulties, eventually it was published in London in 1751. Difficulties including multiple lost copies as ships carrying the manuscript were taken by the French. The published version of Bartram's observation was derided immediately for its lack of style, minimal details, and printer errors. To put it in starker terms, one of his greatest accomplishments was by and large a disappointment. These same qualities have shaped subsequent scholarship to the present. Summarizing the criticisms which have plagued observations, William H. Getzman wrote, quote, "What promised to be a vivid adventure or a detailed scientific report was neither," end quote. The book seems to be just enough of both sides of that spectrum to remain relevant to scholarly conversations, but not enough of either to make anyone truly satisfied. One of Observation's earliest and fiercest critics was Per Kalm, who thought the book brought no new information to its readers and instead repeated things that were already known. It was really a sort of backhanded compliment. Why would Bartram, who knew so much, say so little? Kalm wanted deep thinking analysis and new discoveries, but got the Journal of an American Collector instead of a European naturalist. This way of reading Bartram perpetuates the devaluing of certain kinds of labor in the process of natural history knowledge production, contributing to the sense that Observations is an unscientific text. Perhaps Kalm was bothered by moments such as on the return trip when he writes, when Bartram writes, "I spent my time on Weiser's High Hill, comma, gathering of seeds." Which seeds? Come on, John, give us something here. Still, as Whitfield Bell Jr. writes, everywhere Bartram noted with precision the character and pitch of the terrain, the quality of the soil, and especially the forest growth, which begs the question, how accurate were Bartram's notes? If he's simply a recorder of raw data instead of an interpreter and namer, what can the data he left us tell about the places he passed through at that time? So together with paleoecologist Albert Fulton, who I work with at UB, I've begun to reimagine Bartram's writings with modern data processing, a sort of way of corresponding across centuries instead of oceans. We're finding that Bartram's descriptors are both accurate and cohesive, perhaps more than was previously thought. So with non-metric multidimensional scaling, or NMDS, we're showing that the descriptive language Bartram uses are tied to specific ecosystem types with statistical significance. In other words, we can see on the plotted chart that I have here that words associated with fertile soil or rocky barren ground cluster together. This means two things for us as we consider Bartram's observations. One, it proves his observations of plant life and soil are systematic, accurate, and reliable. And two, it shows that Bartram understood, or at least observed, ecological interconnection and entanglement of vegetation and geology, something which makes sense for a farmer and proto-ecologist. We can talk more about this image if you want to later, but I won't get into all of that. This is just the first week of the journey. I thought that the longer one was even messier and would be harder to understand. And just as a comparison point, this is a similar NMDS used from New York survey data in 1791. Basically, it's very similar. So we're pretty sure that everything he was viewing and marking down, we have a strong sense of the accuracy. So to run an NMDS, I created a spreadsheet of every observation Bartram makes. 822 variables over 49 days of travel. Talk about labor. So this was a different way of encountering the text that brought me closer to it and forced me to encounter each observation that Bartram made. So deciding what constitutes an observation is, of course, subjective, but generally I stuck to several criteria: vegetation, soil, geology, landscape features, buildings, towns, many of the things listed in the title. I could have added animals or people to that list, but decided to really kind of focus on the categories that he, A, most regularly includes day to day, and B, were most directly tied to place. So several of the species listed by Bartram do not match the names used today, so it takes a bit of work to understand what all the species listed are. A prime example of this is the usage of spruce, which will strike many as odd considering there are no spruce species native, with a native range to central Pennsylvania. If you've done any hiking, you will know that hemlock is much more common. So I looked at the 1785 Arbustrum americanum by Humphrey Marshall, who was a cousin of Bartram, and sure enough, he lists hemlock as the hemlock spruce. So we're pretty sure that spruce, or F. Pruce, as the OCR will tell you, makes a lot of sense here. So I've employed quantitative methods and data visualization tools to reveal new insights about the journal. Distant reading is not often used for the analysis of a single text, but in the case of travel narratives and journals, it presents an opportunity to find trends across space rather than time, the way it often is used. So to put that differently, with the use of word frequency, we can better understand the experience of the traveler and their priorities of observation as they move across the land. So here's a one I did of some limestone. So to better understand how this works, we can track the frequency of a single word through the book. This limestone graph shows us how Bartram found himself on ground that was rich in the substance or he found it worthy of noting. It's really a non-geodetic map. In other words, the line represents Bartram's track through the rises and fall of limestone that he mentions in the journal, rather than on a grid, the lat-long grid that we might be more used to with a more common map like this one. But such a map does little to illustrate the experience of traveling and collecting data. Bartram, of course, never gets the bird's eye view from outer space or the X-ray vision into the crust of the Earth. What he does is have the experience of moving through the land. So my graph, this one, really helps to show his sense of limestone as he's moving through the land. I do like, though, that with those lines, you can almost see the similarities in the humps that he's going over. There's a kind of formal similarity there. And so I have to apologize a little bit. This is much better when it's interactive, so this is just a screenshot. But so this process can be repeated to show multiple variables. So if we look at the trees Bartram records on the journey, something he would have been especially attuned to, we can see a constantly evolving treescape as he moves north to Lake Ontario and back again. So one of the most obvious features of the line graph is this kind of double hump that we see, which is really easily explained by the fact that it's an out and back mission. He goes, he sits in Onondaga, he stops recording the tree data, and then he returns. And so the two halves are not symmetrical because he really attempts to avoid redundancy. So on August 8th, he writes, "We continued our journey without meeting anything worthy of remarking. The ground we passed rode over in our way out." So he's just saying nothing new here. So we can visualize the same tree data as area instead of a line graph, which provides an image that mirrors the ridge and valley formations of Pennsylvania and New York. We can almost see Bartram, Evans, and Weiser crossing these mountains, each with its own unique forest ecosystem. And one of the most interesting aspects of this graph, or map, if we choose to call it that, is the kinds of trees noticed by Bartram as he enters and exits Onondaga. The forests surrounding Onondaga have large percentages of mast trees, chestnuts, beech, hickory, oak. And while the Haudenosaunee people are known for their corn production and consumption, these nuts and acorns would still have provided an ample food source with essential fats and proteins. Likewise, these trees would have provided fodder and habitat to various game species that they would have relied on. And while Bartram seems to have been keenly aware of interconnection, he ironically doesn't narrate the data in a way that includes people. He records the abundance of the fields and forests where indigenous peoples lived, but is ignorant of the immense labor which went into such places. As he writes, quote, "Whatever nature has done for them, and she is nowhere more bountiful, they are too lazy by any trouble to improve," end quote. So taking a step further, these forests would have looked much different at the end of the Ice Age. So even after the retreat of glaciers in the region, hundreds of miles of tundra would remain. So how did these forests form? In the archaeological and fossil pollen records, humans arrived at approximately the same time as these mast species. Some researchers argue that the seeds of these trees were carried along migration routes as glaciers retreated instead of already standing trees attracting inhabitants. To put it even more simply, there's a chance that the forests of North America were not only managed by indigenous people, but planted by them. So in this way, Bartram erases the labor of ecosystem management done by indigenous people. As a farmer, he would have been very much aware of the work required to tend crops and trees to promote the production of species that benefit humans. Yet he seems oblivious to it in this context. According to one of the classic Bartram scholars, Francis Harper, Bartram's writing, quote, "gives us a picture of certain parts of the American wilderness at a period when it was still largely primeval and unspoiled, and it is to be treasured on that account." We now recognize that the North America of John Bartram was no pure wilderness. Still, Observations offers a remarkable record of the conditions of American forests in the middle of the 18th century. His observations are a treasure, to borrow Harper's word, not because it's a window into unspoiled wilderness, but because it's one of the most detailed records we have of land that was actively managed by indigenous people, whether he realized it or not. How well did Bartram understand this active management? Likely not very well, but Bartram was a keen observer, and he records various hints of indigenous ingenuity, such as bushes planted around the sugar maples, which suggests a higher level of stewardship than he lets on. So there's a tension between Bartram's lived experience, the one he records and sets down in writing for us, and the narration of data he leaves us. The field of ecology has helped us to see how ecosystems function and how vulnerable those systems are to change, but we often fail to see humans as part of the equation. There are important lessons as we find ourselves again facing radical changes in our forest canopies. All this is to say that different kinds of labor and different kinds of thinking can bring us closer or push us away from the world we live and those we share it with. Thank you.
Good morning. Welcome to Peale's Museum. I'm going to start today just by saying that the labor of natural history is not over. We're still laboring to describe new species and to understand the genetic and phenotypic diversity of animals and plants all across the world. And I've been very fortunate to have been connected in this endeavor. I'm the curator of birds at the Delaware Museum of Nature and Science, where I am the steward of over 116,000 specimens of birds from all around the world. And I've personally prepared hundreds of taxidermied specimens for the museum. I was trained at the Academy of Natural Sciences under the curator of birds there, Jason Weckstein. And Weckstein was trained under Fred Sheldon, who was a former curator of the Academy and LSU Museum. And Fred Sheldon was trained by Charles Sibley, the curator of birds at the Yale Peabody Museum. Dr. Sibley was the first scientist in history to use molecules to attempt to reconstruct the evolutionary history of birds. And to this day, we're still sequencing the genomes of hundreds of species to describe the shape of the evolutionary tree of birds and to understand the evolutionary past and also just to describe the diversity that we see out there in nature. We can't conserve biodiversity if we don't know what units we're conserving. And we have limited resources to spread across the species in need. And so my work is, there's a scientific labor and there's also a historical labor that I'm going to tell you about. So the methods that we use for specimen preparation, and they go way back. And there's a great history here in Philadelphia of scientific ornithology. And a lot of this begins with Charles Peale. In 1786, in the Pennsylvania Packet, Peale announced that he was ever desirous to please and entertain the public, and he would make part of his house a repository for natural curiosities. He has acquired the means of preserving birds and animals in their natural form, and he intends to place in his collection of curiosities every curious species of birds and animals that he's able to obtain belonging to North and South America. At first, Peale was using what he called antiseptic powder to preserve bird specimens, which was essentially ground black pepper and some different spices that were very tasty to the domestic beetles that destroyed his collections. And so it wasn't until about 1788 that Peale developed an ingenious method to preserve his specimens. He dissolved powdered arsenic into a hot bath of water, and then he dipped his specimens into the bath and then hung them up to dry. The very evening he first did this, he wrote to a colleague, "I began and continued my labor this whole day in washing my birds and beasts in the arsenic water. Having my hands continually wet, I find a considerable soreness at the end of my fingers, so much that I had a small fever at night and some restlessness." Thankfully, we're not using arsenic any longer in the bird collections. For about 100 years, we kicked our arsenic habit about a century ago. And now we've got these wonderful cabinets with rubber gaskets, and the specimens that we preserve today will exist for hundreds of years. I have no doubt, as long as we don't destroy ourselves, we'll still have these specimens, many hundreds of years in the future. So Mr. Peale moved his museum out of his home into Philosophical Hall in 1794. What we see here is Thomas Birch's lovely view of the back lawn of Independence Hall and Philosophical Hall, just right across the street. So if you haven't had a chance to go stroll through those spaces, highly encourage you to do so. And then on the right there, you see the modern reproduction of the museum sign that hung, and we can actually see that sign in the background in Birch's view. So Birch's view, I think this is a 1802, I believe. And here on the left, we see the Pennsylvania State House, which eventually became Independence Hall, as we know it today. And in 1802, Peale moved just next door, moved his collections out of Philosophical Hall and into the Pennsylvania State House. And this is because that Independence Hall was vacant for the first time in living memory, because the government of the United States moved down to the new capital, Washington, D.C. And so Peale displayed his specimens up on the second floor in the long room. And you can see on the left in a photograph taken in about 1920 what the long room looked like empty. And on the right is a watercolor attributed to Charles or Titian Peale II that shows these glass cases lining the left wall there. The windows on the right side of the image are actually north-facing, facing over what we would see the Constitution Center today. And so in 1804, Peale published a little pamphlet that he would hand out to visitors of the museum, in which he described the bird section quite concisely. The Linnaean classification is generally adopted throughout the animal department. In the long room, Linnaeus' classification of birds with the characters of each order and genus is, for want of space to display it better, exhibited in a gilt frame at the entrance of the long room. All the birds are in glass cases, the insides of which are painted to represent the appropriate scenery, mountains, plains, or waters, the birds being placed on branches or artificial rocks, etc. These cases, rising 12 feet from the floor, extend the whole length of this room, which is 100 feet, producing an uncommonly elegant display. In frames over each case, the genus is first noted, then their species and names in Latin, English, and French, referring to the numbers which are attached to each species. There are now in this collection perhaps all the birds belonging to the middle, many of which likewise belong to the northern and southern states, and a considerable number from South America, Europe, Africa, Asia, New Holland, and the recently discovered islands of the South Seas. The number exceeds 760 without the admission of any duplicates, contained in 140 cases. Talk about the labor of natural history. This collection took 2 decades to assemble to this point, but alas. A famous Philadelphian, the founder of this society, once wrote that if you would not be forgotten as soon as you are dead and rotten, then write something worth reading, or do something worth the writing. Unfortunately, Mr. Peale failed to publish a catalog of his bird specimens. And after his death in 1827, his children were perhaps not as successful as managing the museum as he was, and the Philadelphia Museum was sold, the collections were sold and dispersed. Many of them were destroyed. The remnants of Peale's bird collection, after a long circuitous path, some of them ended up in the American Museum in New York, not the American Museum of Natural History. I'm talking about P.T. Barnum's American Museum, which burned down in the 1860s. And another half made its way to Massachusetts, where the specimens were stored in a barn in Newtonville, Massachusetts for several decades. And eventually the original stand, the mounts that they were, the wooden mounts, and any labels that had data with these specimens were disassociated with the specimens themselves. To this day, there is only one original label from a Peale bird, and these are the golden pheasants that George Washington gave to Peale in the 1780s. And those birds still exist up in the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard, and the original wooden label says "Presented by General Washington." So, unfortunately, because Peale didn't publish a catalog of his work, historians have for 2 centuries now misattributed Peale's accomplishments to Alexander Wilson, the poet-naturalist who published the first book devoted to American birds, American Ornithology, published between 1808 and 1814. Wilson was an incredible ornithologist, no doubt, and he was a friend and colleague of Peale, but historians have misinterpreted this history to an extreme extent. So over the last several years, I've began my own labor in trying to correct this misunderstanding. The Ornithology and Peale's Museum project is a component of a larger project called America's Earliest Museums, in which myself and several editors, including John Van Horn, our lead editor who's here in the room today, and we've attempted to inventory every object that is known to have been in Peale's museum over a 50-year span. This is thousands and thousands of objects. And on the ornithology front, I came on to edit the birds portion of this project. And personally, I transcribed hundreds of pages of overlooked primary sources. These are handwritten, unpublished sources that have never seen the light of day. The Peale Museum accessions book, ledgers and catalogs, Peale's 27 unpublished lectures on systematic ornithology, which he delivered in Philosophical Hall and then in the State House between 1799 and 1802. Letters and diaries and memoranda in the APS library and in the Academy archives and the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And I've been to the Museum of Comparative Zoology, and I've personally handled every specimen that is thought to have been from Peale's museum. And I've compiled all of these sources. We went through all the old newspapers and broadsides. Any announcement that was made of a specimen that was donated to this museum all went into giant spreadsheet. And after many years of labor, I've compiled primary sources for 625 species of birds with Linnaean designations that were in Peale's museum. And also transcribed all of the primary sources. So the goal here was to build this website, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about. We have a very short amount of time here to talk about such a giant project. But I can say just right off the bat, Peale's collection was international in scope. About 50% of the specimens were from North America. This gives us just a little general overview. On the y-axis, we see the number of species, and on the x-axis, we see a timeline from 1785 until the final line. There's 1845. So you can see that this is the accumulation of species in Peale's museum of North American species. And clearly, Peale had 80% of the North American collection already stuffed and mounted in the cabinets with Linnaean names attached prior to Wilson's arrival. And so Wilson then contributed himself a portion of this collection, but certainly I think we could dispense with the father of American ornithology moniker when we talk about Wilson in this case. So the website, this is a sneak preview of the website. It's called America's Earliest Museums, and it's searchable. It's text searchable, and this is the great value of this. And you'll be able to put text into a search bar and click, and it will search through the thousands of records and look for any example of that phrase or word that you're searching for. Here we've searched for mounted taxidermy, and here we have the American goshawk mounted taxidermy. So let's take a peek at this record. Right, so you click on it and you'll see a photo. This specimen is actually, I rediscovered this specimen in the Academy's collection a couple years ago. We can scroll down and we see the primary source for that species in Peale's museum. We can scroll down again. It was accessioned by 1799. Here's the original text from Peale's lecture with his original orthography. And on the left, we can click on a photograph and see Peale's writing for himself with the page with the American goshawk account. In the case where we don't have a photo of the specimen, we've substituted the planche illuminée from Buffon, and we can here look into the Eurasian sparrowhawk, Accipiter nisus, same deal. We can go down and look through scroll down, and we see the source text. We can read Peale's account from his 13th lecture about this species, and here we could click on the original, an image of the original source, and here, sure enough, Peale cites Buffon, Planche illuminée 412. So we've used the images that Peale himself looked at to make his species determinations. And we also have a little note here that this species was donated by Thomas Hall, and we found that in the accessions book. And then in the notes column, then we have a whole bunch of information about Thomas Hall and his natural history collection in London and how Peale and Hall got acquainted. So this website is under development. As you can imagine, there are thousands of images and web pages. In the meantime, while it's in development, I've published the database of Ornithology and Peale's Museum with all the original transcriptions of these sources that you could download here at my ResearchGate page, and I'd be happy to share that with you. And it's a citable work with a DOI in the meantime while we wait for this website to be completed. So thank you very much to all the partners, and John Van Horn and Bob Peck and Adriana and Thomas and everybody at APS and the Academy who's helped to put together this great symposium. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. This is such an intimidating stage to be on, but fantastic. Thank you so much for the invitation to be, or at least accepting my paper. And I'm going to try to honor the standards that have been set so far by the first two presentation. And I'm really excited to present my work because I think there are some connections there with the other speakers. So the Exhumation of the Mastodon by Charles Wilson Peale, or Looking at the Laborious Making of the Deep Past. Discoveries of fossils of elephant-like animals in North America as early as the 17th century sparked great discussions in Europe. The remains of the American incognitum, as the mysterious animals was referred, were central in debates on animals and plants of the Americas. In the late 18th century, the idea that the climate of North America caused plants and animals to degenerate held a lot of credit. The French naturalist Buffon had made a convincing case for this theory in his writings, and to some American naturalists and statements, this degeneracy theory represented obviously a stain on the reputation of their newly independent country and an obstacle to investments in its natural resources. So when Peale exhumed the skeleton of a mastodon in 1801, the importance of the discovery was not lost on him and some of his contemporaries. Peale's painting of the exhumation of the mastodon has been traditionally interpreted in connection to the degeneracy theory debate and to the rise of catastrophism as a theory to explain the history of the Earth and the extinction of ancient species. In this light, Peale produced a visual manifesto for an empiric study of nature, challenging the idea of a great and continuous chain of beings through time. But this interpretation of the painting captures only the intellectual side of the story that we're invited to see. There's actually much more to see in this painting. Many turns, as we call them, in the historiography of science have shown that obviously ideas are not the whole story. And let us take a new look at Peale's painting, informed by some of those recent turns in the historiography of paleontology and geology in particular. The first turn is toward labor in paleontology. It is only recently that historians of paleontology have begun to pay closer attention to the importance of labor and logistics in fossil collecting. There is, for example, Lydia Barrett's work on modern earth worker. We can also think about Caitlin Wiley on the sociology of fossil preparators. The second turn that is also interesting and that could inform a new look at this painting relates to the critical examination of the category of deep past. The deep past needs to be examined as a category entangled in social and political life. It is not only a geological notion, but also a dimension of politics and power struggles over lands, resources, and narratives. So with this new look, I hope to show that this painting by Peale can actually serve as a map to reframe the history of paleontology in more contemporaneous terms. Peale painting is less about the mastodon and the scientific ramification of its discovery. After all, where is the mastodon in this painting? It is much more about the process of extraction. The title itself tells us that the exhumation, rather than the mastodon, is what we are witnessing. This painting is most crowded scene. We see Peale and his family on the right, about 20 workers either in the pit or working on the wheel, and more spectators with women and children, elderly persons as well. The painting offers a great variety of bodies at rest and in motion. People dig, pull, push, cut, hold, and wash. The many are working as one to empty the pit and recover the remains. Peale's commanding arm, bright white shirt, and high ground position shows him as a leader of men. It is a celebration of organized labor and its transformative powers. In the essay that Rembrandt, one of Peale's sons, published in the years after the discovery, the effort and endurance of workers are praised more than once. But Peale himself refers to his own experience of labor. In an epistle to a friend on the meaning of preserving health, published in 1803, so a couple years after the exhumation, and as Peale was contemplating painting this piece, Peale writes about the healing power of labor that he experienced at the exhumation site. A cold wind arose in the night, which, blowing on my shoulders, produced a violent rheumatic pain. But compelled to join my utmost exertion to retrieve an accident in the work, the violence of the exercise produces a general and plentiful perspiration for some hours, and to my great astonishment, totally removed the rheumatism, when I exclaimed, "What a blessing is the necessity of labor." According to Rembrandt's account of the discovery, many local people began to flock around the pit, and Peale presented the exhumation and the work it requires as a public spectacle, an enthusiastic and federative moment around the transformative and healing powers even of labor. The whole process appears as an exercise in rejuvenation, dare we say as an exercise in rebirth. Rebirth of the mastodon, birth of a nation, and rebirth of Peale himself. But the painting is also a celebration of technological ingenuity. The mastodon is only presented through a few details, very small pictorial details. Some bones, a long scroll on the right that represents an engraving of what appears to be a leg of the mastodon. So it is not the main show of the painting. The lead of the show is the wheel that occupies the center of the painting. The scaffolding itself structures the whole composition. The light on the side of it, reflected on the wheel, draws the spectator's eye toward it in a similar fashion as Peale's bright white shirt. The wheel was also celebrated in Rembrandt's narrative of the discovery. Rembrandt tells us that the wheel was designed and constructed on the spot by an ingenious millwright. The machine was built to empty the pit of its water more effectively, and Peale's painting appears as a representation of an industrious utopia where ingenious engineering and collective labor achieve a single task. Peale's celebration of labor and technical ingenuity was meant to promote the collection of fossil remains to the status of an historical event. And I think this is one of the most intriguing and original take here by Peale. The exhumation is the result of Peale trying his hand at the high genre of historical painting. In the traditional hierarchy of genre, historical painting sits at the top, before portraits and landscapes. Peale earned his reputation as a portraitist, at least as an artist, portraitist of influential figures. But as a young artist, Peale actually trained under one of the most renowned British and American historical painter of his time, Benjamin West. But despite this training, Peale resorted to a career as a portraitist which is a much secure and better revenue stream. But this painting actually turned out to be Peale's late opportunity to test out some of his early ambitions at historical painting. In 1807, he wrote to his mentor West to share his experience painting the exhumation of the Mastodon. And that's another kind of labor here that West refers to. He writes, "The desire to represent the scene of getting up the mammoth bones, it being a very interesting article of the museum last summer, I undertook a picture of it. I find it much less difficult than I imagined, and have ever since regretted that I had not taken a larger canvas and devoted more time to give a higher finish to the piece." Larger canvas were usually reserved for historical subjects. So Peale eventually saw the exhumation of the fossils as a worthy subject for a historical painting, which is quite original considering that historical subjects are typically drawn from religious scriptures, mythology, military history, any sort of nation-building events. To reach his goal, Peale conflated different temporalities in this painting. So there's actually a very ambitious idea behind this painting. He conflated mythological temporalities with geological ones and technological ones. And this conflation of temporalities allowed Peale to elevate the exhumation of fossils as an important moment in the early history of this new nation. The first temporality is mythological. With a reference to what Rembrandt Peale in his essay on the exhumation calls a confused Indian tradition regarding the fate of the Mastodon, how it lived, how it went extinct. So in a retelling of different indigenous stories, Rembrandt explains that this Mastodon was a terrible, terrifying creature, destroying everything in its path, and terrifying the inhabitants, which are referred as the unhappy here. But suddenly the forked lightning gleamed around, and loudest thunder rocked the globe. The bolts of heaven were hurled upon the cruel destroyers alone, leaving the continent of America free from this terrible beast. Peale actually refers to this mythological temporality with a very small pictorial detail. On the right end of the picture, you might see something that looks like a little lightning bolt and a little bit of fire. So it's a small pictorial reference here to this mythological time. The geological temporality is represented through the very process of piecing together fossil remains, taking them out of the ground. Peale and his sons hold a large engraving scrolls, serving as a sort of map to that very endeavor of piecing together the physical evidence. We can also see under the wheel, and that's a smaller detail again, under the wheel, a man beginning to wash and arrange the other fossil remains that have already been taken out of the pit. The third temporality is technological. It has to do with the sense of urgency that the composition is trying to convey. In my opinion, Peale is not really successful at doing this, but there are a lot of pictorial detail I'll be happy to discuss later. A storm is actually brewing. A storm is coming. If you look at the sky and obviously the thunder in the back. And the excavation site is therefore very much threatened. The wheel allows for the exhumation process to be completed in time, beating essentially here the rain. Peale tried to express that sense of immediacy and drama through various pictorial detail. So Peale ties together the work of nation building here with the work of transforming the land, extracting its resources, therefore making paleontology, presenting paleontology and natural sciences as key players in that process. Finally, the exhumation of the Mastodon compares with a much earlier attempt by Peale at historical painting, a painting titled George Washington and His Generals at Yorktown from 1784. The similarities between the two paintings can serve as evidence that Peale conceived of the exhumation of fossils as an historic event, echoing other important historical events in the history of the new American nation. Both paintings adopt a similar plan for their overall composition. We have a group of protagonists on the right, with trees closing the space on the right as well, open horizon and sky on the left, with a source of light coming from the far left, relatively similar ratio of water, land, and sky, dramatic usage of clouds. Most interestingly, though, are similarities between Washington and Peale himself. Peale painting portraits of Washington, but in the case of the exhumation of the Mastodon, he portrayed himself in the same fashion as the general and founding father of the new nation. They both extend a commanding right arm, directing the spectator toward, in one case, the battlefield, in the other case, just the field. And both observe an elegant posture, which is usually referred as a contrapposto, where the body rests mostly on one hip, giving a subtle movement and grace to the whole body. These two events are both the victory at Yorktown and the exhumation of the Mastodon are both victories of engineering and labor. Yorktown was a crucial victory for the Continental Army, but a victory acquired through the application of siege techniques involving the digging of multiple trenches and the building of outposts. The exhumation of the Mastodon, painting by Peale, is also a victory of engineering and labor, turning a swampy pit into a treasure trove of natural marvels and outrunning the destructive forces of a storm. Both events deal with intimately and physically dealing with the land, digging it to find and set foundations. Whether or not this parallel was intentional to Peale, the comparison showed that this painting is essentially echoed as a celebration of labor and engineering, portrayed as setting the foundation of a new nation into the earth and in time. So in conclusion, the exhumation of the Mastodon can, at least that's the way it appears to me, can serve as a map for a new historiography of paleontology that conceives paleontology not exclusively as a scientific endeavor in covering the deep past of our planet, but also as a labor-intensive technological process, leaving its own mark on the land, generating occasion for significant events, and producing materials for powerful narratives that harness the riveting depth of geological time. The exhumation of the Mastodon, I argue, can serve as a visual historiographical agenda, if you will, articulating together questions that resonate throughout 200 years of history of modern paleontology, namely the fact that paleontology is a labor-intensive science that relies on skills and logistics. Secondly, that paleontology and engineering share a very long history. Thirdly, that fossil collecting is a form of territorial endeavor. And finally, a history of paleontology that focuses on the political power of deep past narrative. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. I'd like to thank the organizers for this conference. It's really been a very stimulating one and very useful for me. And yeah, I'm going to make a few remarks. I think they'll resonate with this. It's a bit different presentation than other presentations in this panel, but I think it'll resonate with some of the remarks about data, about the labor aspect of natural history, and about art that was just talked about. So I'll present a kind of brief snapshot of a current research project I'm working on about scientific images and scientific illustration in the 19th century primarily. So I'm trained as an art historian and have been interested in adopting an art historical approach to the history of science. 18th and 19th century science and art emerged from what Nancy Rose Marshall identified as a shared epistemological condition. Each consists of, her quote, rather loosely framed practices and knowledges that emerge from shared beliefs in a society. In particular, I've been interested in what the American psychologist Howard Gruber has called the aesthetic feeling of science, the ways that aesthetic ideas inform the mode of scientific observation and guide its theoretical formulation. Image making in science is not limited to the mere illustration of pre-formulated scientific ideas, but can be and has been an integral part of scientific theorization. That is an integral part of scientific thought. So that's kind of the aim of my project, to sort of restore the agency of images to this kind of telling of the history of science. So here for this talk, I'll take an isolated example to sort of introduce this line of inquiry. I'm going to talk about the famous Prussian naturalist, Alexander von Humboldt, who I'm sure everyone here knows. Hopefully I'll be able to, kind of bring out something a bit different and something that'll be interesting to you. So, of course, he lived. He was born in 1769, died in 1859, 90 years life. He's probably best remembered for his renowned 5-year exploration of the Americas at the turn of the 19th century. He's also well known, of course, for his concept of cosmos, which he used to describe a unified, system-based approach to nature. Written accounts of his travels, as well as numerous scientific texts elaborating the data and specimens collected during his exploration, were massively influential books in their time, particularly for American scientists and artists, from Charles Willson Peale, as we just heard about, to Frederick Church. And this is just one of Church's very well-known paintings of Cotopaxi, kind of volcano that we'll see in Humboldt's own illustrations in a moment. And then to kind of speak to this panel and the Philadelphia connection, I'll just briefly mention that Humboldt came to the U.S. Only once in his life at the conclusion of his American excursions in 1804. He landed in Philadelphia almost exactly 220 years ago and was received by Peale and other members of the American Philosophical Society, who sort of showed him around the city and took him into Peale's museum before, of course, departing for Washington, where he met with President Jefferson and James Madison. So the title of my remarks, Portrait of Nature, refers to a phrase used by Humboldt to describe his own methodological approach to natural history. So what I want to do is ask, what is at stake in Humboldt's choice of phrase? Why would a 19th century scientist use the language of art to describe his scientific ambitions? And what does it mean for Humboldt's own use of images? Of course, much can be said about the deep connections between art and natural science in the 18th and 19th centuries, prior to the fragmentation of the two cultures in the 20th. But in this presentation, I want to focus on one of Humboldt's most interesting and perhaps most iconic images, produced for his 1805 essay on the geography of plants. The book itself was a groundbreaking account of the geographical distribution of global plant life as a function of altitude and climate. Because of its approach, many scholars consider the work to be, one of the earliest texts of modern ecology. The essay was one of the first texts Humboldt wrote after his return to Europe, following his 5-year exploration in the Americas. With his botanist companion, I should mention, Aimé Bonpland, who works on this book with Humboldt and works on this diagram that we'll move to now. So the text was accompanied by an elaborate hand-colored foldout entitled Physical Tableau of the Andes and Neighboring Countries, which you can see on the screen. At the center of the foldout is a kind of modified landscape depicting two peaks of the Andean mountain range in Ecuador. Their names are inscribed in the illustration, which identifies them as Chimborazo and Cotopaxi. And Cotopaxi is the volcano painted in the church painting we just saw. So these are two of the highest peaks in the region and the highest that Humboldt encountered in his travels. So the scale of the mountain is given in meters on the right-hand side of the picture, if you can see the kind of running column of numbers. So this corresponds to the transition in color from the verdant green at the base to the white snow-capped peaks at the top. Bordering the central landscape image are detailed columns of data that Humboldt and Bonpland gathered while traveling through the Americas. The data include readings of temperature, altitude, barometric pressure, the size of animals based on the elevation at which they were observed, as well as the blue of the sky as measured by a cyanometer, one of the more kind of peculiar technical instruments that Humboldt used. As you can see, the text is not confined, or words are not confined to the margin of the picture. Words are written near the peaks of the mountains, and the scientific names of plants are written on the face of Chimborazo according to their location and respective elevation. The names are imbued with an additional representational component. They slant and curve to indicate their appearance in the landscape. In the essay, Humboldt is careful to point to the painstaking labor involved in the collection of specimens and data, which can only be visually surmised by the extensive detail of the illustration and the sheer number of names included. And here you can see the names of the Cotopaxi. Despite its scientific rigor, there's a significant subjective component of the image that undermined its objectivity. In a passage extolling the grandeur and magnitude of Cotopaxi, the volcano positioned at the back of the image, farthest away from the viewer, Humboldt admits, quote, "In reality, Cotopaxi is not as close to Chimborazo as it seems in my picture." Humboldt explains that if one were observing the mountain in the landscape, one would not see Cotopaxi looming behind Chimborazo, but rather another volcano that has collapsed against the side of Chimborazo. Humboldt explains his preference for the topographically incorrect inclusion of Cotopaxi by appealing to its geological importance and to a subjective experience he had while preparing a sketch of the landscape in the field. Of this experience, Humboldt writes, quote, "I heard the underground groans of this volcano when I was in the port undertaking the first sketch of this tableau. The mouth of Cotopaxi was at a distance of 42 nautical leagues, yet its explosions sounded like repeated artillery fire." End quote. So Humboldt's subjective sensory experience, in this case hearing the volcano from a great distance and being impressed by its colossal scale, is visually translated into the tableau, affecting Humboldt's presentation of the landscape. And more could be said about the status of subjective experience in Humboldt's work, but I'll kind of pass over that point now. So as this anecdote shows, mimetic veracity is not Humboldt's ultimate concern. The image is intended less as a lifelike depiction of landscape and more as the visualization of multiple concrete data points carefully cross-referenced with each other. This is perhaps why the tableau takes on a striking, non-naturalistic form, which is uncharacteristic of the kinds of images that are usually found in Humboldt's more picturesque, more narrative works. This one, for instance, published in Humboldt's Views of the Cordilleras and Monuments of the Indigenous Peoples of the Americas, only a few years after the essay on plants, is also based on one of Humboldt's sketches of Chimborazo. So the illustration conforms to standard landscape conventions of the time and would have presented a much more familiar image to early 19th century viewers. Compared to this picturesque view, the peaks of the tableau are abstracted from their surroundings. There are no animals or figures in the foreground of the image to position the viewer in space. Indeed, the mountains do not seem to be observed from any real point in the landscape. Furthermore, the view of the landscape is compressed by the columns of data on either side of the illustration, which has the effect of elongating the image, emphasizing the verticality of the peaks, which of course allows for the illustration to function again, not only as a kind of mimetic representation of the contours of the mountains, but also as an amenable surface for the inscription of data. The picture itself, along with its adjacent columns, in this way, proposes to be read and interpreted as much as looked at. It functions as a diagram, and this is one of my claims, where the connections between the disparate parts of the representation matter more than the picture's correspondence to nature. This is how Humboldt himself writes of it in the essay. The tableau should be, he writes, quote, capable of suggesting unexpected analogies to those who will study its details, end quote. So as a kind of diagram, therefore, or what Humboldt calls a botanical map, the tableau is not merely descriptive, but generative. It unlocks in the viewer more than what is contained by the page. It's clear from his description in the essay that Humboldt is invested in more than just the success of the tableau as an image which, as he admits, can always be improved with the addition of more data, as in a geographical map. Humboldt is, I think, more importantly, also interested in the tableau as a type of image and the artistic or conceptual possibilities of using it to express his own unique ideas about the unity and interconnection of nature. After several paragraphs outlining his intention behind the tableau, from which I've quoted above, he writes, quote, in stating these ideas, I have been concerned not so much with the tableau that I am presenting here, the imperfections of which I am well aware, but more with the breadth of which this kind of work is capable. So what I'm suggesting here is that with this image, with the tableau, Humboldt is expressing his own dissatisfaction with a certain kind of scientific illustration and also a certain kind of approach to nature and to scientific inquiry. So what is very interesting is the fact that Humboldt sort of first lays out this sort of alternative vision of science, which will become the vision that sort of he's known by. It becomes his kind of obsession, his life's work. So he lays out this vision by using an image, okay? So he uses the tableau to work through and communicate his approach. And sort of the question for my project and for this presentation is, you know, what is the significance of that, you know? Okay, so returning to the picture, Humboldt's tableau can be seen to combine what Noah Herringman has termed the specimen culture of the 18th century, the culture of collection, extraction, and display that has been one of the chief concerns of his conference. So he combines a specimen culture with an emerging landscape aesthetic. I think this aesthetic appealed to Humboldt because of its capacity to reveal place in the coexistence of multiple distinct entities in one image, in a single image. For Humboldt, the representation of specimens apart from place or their surroundings limited the kind of understanding one could have of them. Landscape, by contrast, allowed for the viewer to understand botanical specimens in the context of where they live and grow. So functioning as a landscape image that's visually infused with data, the tableau allows Humboldt to communicate the thesis of the essay on the geography of plants, that to know why plants grow and where they live requires supplementing taxonomic classification and kind of inquiring into the connection between specimen and place. Humboldt claims that one must probe the reciprocal interaction between plants and their environment, and the production of the image is a significant way of doing that. And then to conclude and kind of gesture more broadly, the tableau, and this is what I've been kind of suggesting the whole time, the tableau functions as a vehicle for Humboldt, for articulating Humboldt's vision, his vision of nature, which points to an animating tension of his work, one that is indelibly tied to questions of representation, images, and visualization. And that is a problem of representing the interconnected system of nature when every description or representation of it is necessarily partial. So how do you depict the connection between things something that is essentially not visible. So I think that's what's at stake in Humboldt's tableau, and I believe thinking through this problem is relevant to our understanding of the meaning of scientific images in the 19th century and to many contemporary decolonial reconsiderations of science today. Thank you very much.
Good morning again, everyone. Congratulations to all of you for the papers. They were fantastic, and I think I was furiously writing, trying to think about connections between all of them, and I have some ideas and some observations and some questions. And then I look forward to a robust conversation with the audience. I'm fascinated by the different but interconnected worlds that you're looking at here between Bartram, Peale, Humboldt, between birds, landscapes, scientific technology, time. There are very many things for us to discuss and connections. And so what I see as some of the themes going through all of these works are the interaction of technology, science, and art, as well as of labor, and really not thinking about those things as separate, but as intertwined. And something that I was really intrigued by, thinking of your papers as a whole, is scholarly technology today, as well as that of the 17th to 19th century. So particularly in this last paper, Tyler, I was really struck by the connection, and obviously you didn't see each other's PowerPoints before, but I wonder if anyone else thought this way. The connection between Humboldt's words on Mount Chimborazo reminded me of Kacey's datagraphs on Bartram's work, and so that we could be so separated by technology and artistic representation, but that model of all those words on a mountain could almost be replicated in your data set of words of the description of Bartram's travels. So that was really fascinating to me. And in all of this work, bringing art and data together was really exciting and fascinating, especially for me coming out of art history. There has been a recent surge in data-driven art history, and that was not something that, when I was doing my PhD, was very much explored. So I'm really fascinated by that. Again, and Victor, and your connections between art history, particularly, and the history of science, really uses that very well. I did also want to let you all know that if you do want to take advantage of your discount at PAFA, there is a wonderful church of the Valley of Santa Isabella, so a South American landscape from a later period, so that is part of our Artists' Cultivators show. So thinking about that landscape and science connection is definitely present in the exhibition. So I guess my question to all of you to get started is, in looking at the labor of scientific history in the 18th century, how can we bring contemporary scholarly approaches to technology with all the amazing work you're doing, particularly with data, into a greater understanding of the scientific practices of the 18th century, as well as the interconnection between art and science in that moment. So there's my question to all of you.
Okay. I've been volunteered. Excuse me. It's a great question. And I suppose the way I would answer that, and this might be kind of broad, is one, data is nothing new. I think we often think we've entered this era of big data, and clearly based on all these, we've been collecting data forever. Maybe not forever, but for you know what I'm trying to say. But we think with data, we think with images, and I think as we look back at these older models and these older visualizations, we can see the work that was put in to actually think with these images. It's not just a final, like I'm thinking about that image there. It's not that Humboldt is just saying, here's the final thing, that's it. It's a tool that we're not meant to just look at it and just absorb all that information and know where all those species are. We're supposed to continue to think with it. And I think we can learn from that today too, as we, so often we're told, like, just look at the data. The data speaks for itself. The data never speaks for itself. And so I think we can do a much better job of kind of understanding this shared work of thinking about data that hasn't ended and continues.
I agree with you in terms of it being a tool, but I can, from my own perspective, painting a bird is a very inferior tool, and art is an inferior tool when it comes to expanding our knowledge of the natural world. This is a society that's founded on the acquisition of practical knowledge, useful knowledge, and the truth is, if we're going to conserve biodiversity, our conservation policy, that needs to be driven by quantitative data, not by our subjective impressions of paintings. And so my work as a scientist and a historian has been to reconcile taxonomy with the biodiversity, the patterns that evolution has produced, reconcile that with and try to update the taxonomy, because the old taxonomy was based on these inferior methods. And we've been working to, sequence the genomes of species, recover, probe deeper into the specimens themselves. And this is what what touched me about Peale's work, is it was about the specimens themselves. Those specimens are time capsules of environmental data of a place and time where that species existed. And we're now sequencing the DNA from these historic specimens that are 200 or 300 years old. So maybe we differ in our opinions about these things. But for me, I think that the science and art are not disconnected. I think that they are intertwined, and certainly biological representations and specimens themselves make me feel a certain way, but my feelings, personally, I would prefer to set aside my feelings and drive conservation science and policy, not based on our feelings, but based on a rigorous analysis of data.
Yeah, I love the disagreement. I'll definitely pick your brain. And I'll also love if we can extend the conversation around the question of subjectivity. I think there is a lot of echoes between our talk. But to tackle your question, I think looking back at, at least what I've been doing with Peale, but hearing also these talks, particularly about, I think, the talk on John Bartram was really very interesting, because it shows that the process of collecting data, the process of making data, whether it's through words or diagrams or paintings or any of that, is simultaneously an act of erasure as well. So I think this is the most difficult thing to investigate historically, to render visible, is to understand how, at the same time that we are understanding and collecting something and building information on it, we also covering something else, right? That's just the act of moving. If we just take the image of digging a hole and finding out what's underneath, you're just putting dirt somewhere else, right? And so there's the dialectic, I think, that is almost inescapable in a way. So I think looking back at that and uncovering that, I think that was incredible. I don't understand I didn't understand the graphs, but I understood where it led, and I think that was fantastic, because it was uncovering what was covered in that process of uncovering information about, the fauna, et cetera, that Bartram and the soil that Bartram was finding. So to me, looking at that, we can then use the history to look at our own processes of building, data sets and information, and asking ourselves, what are we covering up as we are uncovering?
Yeah, I would just say too, kind of doing my own research with Humboldt and listening to the presentations, what really comes to me is, I think there's a serious history of data visualization, which is interesting. Because I think a lot of times we think of data as a neutral sort of thing. It's a collection, and then it's on the screen. Maybe you can put it in a graph and somehow, but there's this kind of image of it as a sort of objective presentation. And I think any kind of data visualization, not to say that it's subjective, but there's a choice of what's being shown and to what end. And I think thinking through the ways that data can be visualized, kind of historically and now, is kind of where, I don't know, it's kind of an interesting trend of where scholarship could go.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of that recent work in the field of art history around data visualization, which I think your work fills in nicely. And I definitely think we're going to have a throwdown between ornithology and art history at this conference. Wow. But I did have, before I open it up to the audience, I did have one observation for Victor that I didn't want to forget, which is, I don't know if you have looked at Peale's painting of himself as Noah in the Ark, which is a painting in our collection, which is another history painting of Peale. You know that one?
I've heard of it, but never seen it.
Oh, you've never seen it? Well, sadly, it's not on view right now, but you should look at it. Is it? I don't know, but I do think it has a lot of the same structural qualities of the two works you were presenting as history paintings. So and it's a mythological, biblical painting in that historical language of high art. So I think you should consider that in your discussion. Absolutely. Okay, all right, I see somebody in the front row.
Yeah. My name is Ružina Bajci, and I am an emeritus professor of computer science. Gentlemen and ladies, I ask you, going back to your universities, make sure you connect with the computer scientists, or at least the departments. Create possibilities for the university students to learn your problems, and your students to learn new techniques and technologies that are coming up very fast but could be extremely useful to you. But the separation of arts and sciences and engineering is tragic. We in the engineering school, we need to learn much more history, and we need to more learn your results. But you need to learn the new technology. This is 21st century.
Thank you so much. I do love a call for interdisciplinarity across the arts and sciences. There's a question in the back.
Yeah, I want to go one step farther and look at transdisciplinary collaboration. And speaking philosophically, it is a philosophical society, is looking at phenomenology in the sense that all of our views are subjective because our ideas are in the dark skull of our minds. And that in order to get consensus, we need that social collaboration, interaction. And it's a wonderful panel to represent this. And the phenomenology, the essence of experience, is really looking at reality with many subjective lenses and getting that consensus. And so much like, science is the truth that reveals the myth, art, Picasso says, art is a lie that reveals our truths. The truth and our truths are different, simultaneously existing. And thinking philosophically, I think we need to look at this transdisciplinary relationship, that we're all looking at the same thing, and speaking in different languages. And much like working with a lot of computer scientists and computer virtualization versus visualization are tools in working with augmented imagination versus artificial intelligence, is this conversation that reveals that broader, greater truth. But where do we look at phenomenology in this society? My question. And this is a good example.
Anybody want to take on phenomenology and philosophy?
I can make kind of maybe an inroad. I mean, I'm quite fond of a quotation from Gregory Bateson, where he writes about science as a mode of perception, kind of foregrounding that sense of what you were speaking about. Kind of every experience is sort of mediated in multiple ways. And then, yeah, I think, and Humboldt is also someone who is very conscious of this in his own work. I mean, as I kind of presented in that one anecdote where the image that he presents is not topographically correct, right? But it's correct to his kind of feeling of it, in a way. And I think that points to sort of the changing nature of what constitutes scientific, truth or objectivity. Because Humboldt himself it's interesting because that sort of addition, sort of false addition or fabrication, it doesn't detract from the scientific use of the image. In fact, in some ways, as he sees it, it sort of makes it even more pertinent, allows viewers to make different connections that are not there in the landscape if one was simply viewing it from one position. So maybe that's something about phenomenology. Yeah, thanks.
Oh, hi. I have a question for Matthew. I mean, I love the project because, just assembling all those sources and doing the transcriptions and, contextualizing the specimens and showing the letter, like, an unmediated version of a letter. And, so you can go and look at it yourself, do your own transcription if you want. I just wondered, is your sense that these specimens that you're looking at, that they are unmediated, that they are sort of not constructions, that they are not works of art themselves to some extent? Or I don't know if I'm getting that.
Certainly not.
Okay. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I'm a taxidermist. It's an art form that's passed down from master to pupil to master to pupil, and we can trace this lineage back to Benjamin Silliman and the American Journal of Science and Art. And I'm skinning birds with the same technique and the same methods that Peale was using. Yes, there is a mediated. There is a human component to the specimens, certainly. If our interest is in uncovering some knowledge that is beyond our reach, that's out beyond the horizon. For example, falcons are more closely related to songbirds than they are to hawks and eagles. We know this because we've sequenced the genomes of hundreds of falcons and hawks and eagles now. How I feel about that does not change that fact of nature, that the genomes of falcons and the robin are more similar to each other than to the hawks and eagles. And so, obviously, every time we collect data, there's a subjective impression, right? There's a subjective, my feelings cloud my judgment. My feelings cloud my interpretation of the data. And so as we refine our scientific tools, our tools for data gathering, if our goal is to produce some knowledge that is reliable and agnostic to our feelings, which is the goal of science, one goal of science, then in that process, we need to choose our methods and remove bias at every turn. And that means that when I measure the wing of a bird specimen. I'm very much aware of the fact that the preparator stripped the secondary feathers out of the ulna, and that the length of the secondaries might be exaggerated because of the preparation technique. I'm very aware of that because I do it myself in the prep work. We take all that into account, and hopefully at the end we remove the bias, and what we're left with still has some bias, sure, but we've done our due diligence to remove as much of our subjective experience as possible from the equation, so that what we're left with is a nugget of relatively reliable information that we can use to push policy for conservation, et cetera.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. Over on this side of the room.
Oh, it's already on. Okay, hi. This is a question for Kacey Stewart, and I loved your work and your presentation, and I love how you're, I feel like you talked about distant reading, which I can definitely see you doing, but it's almost like you're doing close reading and distant reading at the same time, which is wonderful. So I just had a question about, the way you charted, limestone, different tree species, et cetera, with your graphs, and then the topographical map, the more standard topographical maps. Have you tried to map those onto each other? Does it work at all?
That's a great question. So that's sort of the easy answer is no, I haven't done that, but the longer answer is that's sort of what's coming next. Sort of the first process was to kind of figure out, what do all these things look like? How can we play around with this data? But what the NMDS is suggesting is that it's pretty reliable. The way that he's actually talking about certain species of trees, as actually being connected to limestone, we're pretty certain that when we do that mapping onto things, it'll be accurate, and which is one of the reasons I actually haven't done it yet, because we're pretty sure it's not going to tell us all that much. It'll just say, yep, he was right. Which I guess is for me where I'm much more interested in how he was feeling, and to the phenomenology question, how he was experiencing these things, because I know exactly what trees were out there based upon what he said. It's cold lists, chestnuts, birch, spruce. Okay, got it, thanks. But I'm more interested in these kind of distant reading ways that we can try to chart his experience and see his experience in a sort of new way. But yes, for me, it's always moving back and forth between close and distant, because any data point is a representation. We don't always think about it that way, but it's a representation of an experience. And so what I've been trying to do is if I do a distant reading and a close reading, I have multiple ways to look at that representation of an experience, which gives me at least a fuller understanding of what that experience might have looked like.
So there's one last question here in the back.
Great, thank you. This is a question to the panel, which I realize is obnoxious as a final question. Picking up on the sort of phenomenological question, I will do the further annoying thing of mentioning Heidegger. And Heidegger raises this category of the tool. And I think this is something that comes up in all 4 of these papers, is the idea of the mechanization of something in order to collect data. You've all spoken about tools, whether that's taxidermy or a wheel. And I'm sort of curious about the ethics of extraction, if we think about this, and the ethics of tool making, using, and perpetuating. Thinking about the ways in which Heidegger wants us to reflect on the human impulse towards tool making is one of dominance that allows us to have sort of a right of use towards, say, timber. But of course, in data collection, there is an extractive principle. And so I'm sort of curious about your own practice around tools, the historical examination of tools, and this sort of larger question of ethics and of the position of humans within that.
I'll take that. It's great because I have fond memories of Heidegger. His writings, obviously, but in the case of paleontology, it's very interesting because it's the discipline is intimately tied with extraction. Anywhere there was a quarry, anywhere there's a pit, any of that, there would be at some point fossils being collected, and later on there would be geological surveys that are either mapping things that could be mined or that are just going where there's already been some mining. So there is a very long history of that. Interestingly enough, that history is just starting to be uncovered by great scholarship that's being done, but we're still not really understanding the full scope of that. And so there is a very strange paradox, right? Because you raised the question of ethics, and a lot of how, at least paleontology, a lot of paleobiologists are trying to rebrand themselves is to think of their disciplines as a way to access deep time, our understanding of the fact that we're living on a fragile planet that has a long history, etc. But at the same time, all of that data that we've been collecting has essentially been incredibly tied to all sorts of exploitative extraction processes, right? So how do we reconcile these two, this history and these aspirations? I think is a very interesting question, especially when it comes to earth sciences and paleo sciences. Yeah.
Does anybody else want to respond to that?
Yes, please. I'm a collector of bird specimens, and I'm licensed by the government, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, in the state of Pennsylvania, and state of Delaware, to collect bird specimens. I feel that we have an ethical imperative to collect bird specimens, and that the work we do is the last line of defense before extinction. Back in the 1970s, DDT was causing massive reproductive failure across the birds, particularly birds of prey, and we live in a free market economy, supposedly, and when you come along and you say DDT is causing the reproductive failure of the bald eagle, there's a company that makes DDT, and they say you can't say that about our product, and so that goes to the court. Eventually, the legislature banned DDT, and the bald eagles have rebounded, and the peregrine falcons and the merlins and kestrels have rebounded, but only because data was presented in a court of law that proved beyond a reasonable doubt the cause of the DDT, that cause. And our specimen collection at the Delaware Museum was used to generate the data set that was presented in the court that got the judge to sign off on direct dosing of DDT to bald eagles to prove the causality. If it wasn't for hundreds of students at the Quaker boarding school in Westtown collecting eggs over decades, which was extractive, as you say, if it wasn't for those kids collecting all those eggs, we wouldn't even have bald eagles now. We wouldn't have peregrine falcons. Collecting is an absolutely essential activity that it's the last place we can get data when, pardon my French, when shit hits the fan, right? We have to, I think we need to temper our language about extraction and decolonization. Yeah, we need to have compassion, and we need to talk about the history of science in America, but we can't decouple it from the purpose of scientific exploration. And the truth is, the American robin could crash tomorrow, and guess what's going to happen when that happens? You're going to come to the museum, and you're going to say, "Hey, can we use those specimens that you've been collecting to generate data to try to save the robin?" So I think that we need to reframe this discussion of collecting not as a infraction against our ethical code, but actually as an ethical imperative, a moral imperative. Thanks.
That seems like an excellent point to break for coffee.